Hello, everybody, and welcome to the May nanoTalks about conceptualizing neutrality. My name is Janos, and together with my colleague Sandro, we will guide you through this evening. Before we dive into the topic, I would like to say a few words about REACH, the organization behind the nanoTalks. REACH is a think tank where we aim at connecting science, society, and politics. We aim at well-informed public decisions with a modern science-based worldview. We have over 300 members all across Switzerland. If you want to find out more about REACH, you can find more information on reach.ch and our social media sites on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. You could also sign up to our newsletter if you like to hear more of us. If you like to get active at REACH, you're always welcome. We are really a grassroots organization where everyone is welcome. Apart from events like this nanoTalks, we also have a blog where we talk about scientific topics in an easily accessible way. Then we also have a podcast called Weiterwissen in German. The public events, for example, nanoTalks, but also a format called Reaching into the Rabbit Hole, where we combine storytelling and science. We also have the format called Pizza, Philosophy and Science, where we think about a topic really deeply while eating pizza. For hot public debates in Switzerland, we also publish policy recommendations if there is a clear scientific view on the topic. Now, let's conceptualize neutrality. As a first speaker, Pascal Lottaz will go with us on a historical journey about neutrality in international relations. Afterwards, Inga will take us on a more philosophical path where she talks about why neutrality is maybe not as trivial as it sounds and which other words and concepts might also be considered in a scientific philosophical way. If you have questions emerging during the presentations, you can ask them on Slido. Just scan the QR code on the left or go to sly.do and enter the code nano-may22. You can also find the link in the YouTube video description. Now, let me introduce Pascal Lottaz to you. He studied history and philosophy at the University of Fribourg. Afterwards, he obtained a master's degree in public policy and a PhD in international relations in Japan. Currently, he is an adjunct professor for European politics at Temple University and adjunct researcher at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Studies. He lives in Japan and is currently connected from Tokyo to us. Over there, it's already midnight. So Pascal, thank you very much for joining this nanotalk. We really appreciate your night shift. And with this, I would like to hand over the stage to you.
Thank you very much, Janos, for your kind introduction. So let me share my screen with you. I think you should see it now. And let me start the presentation. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me to present my research topic here in your nanotalk. I'm always happy to talk about neutrality, and I'll try to compress this as much as I can into the 15 minutes allotted. I do specialize on neutrality very generally inside international relations. And what this study is all about is probably best exemplified on my first slide. The study of neutrality is, of course, like World War III breaks out and Switzerland's got to do nothing. I'm kidding. The study of neutrality is, of course, about studying those who do something. This is one of the stereotypes that you find quite often, and which is cool to show why it might make sense to rethink the concept, whether it's really nothing. And my claim is no, it's the opposite. It's actually quite a lot. So I study actors, right? Neutral actors. And what do I mean by that? Usually we think about neutrals mainly as countries, but that's really only half the story. There's there's also other actors that do use neutrality, especially like institutional actors, to whom the concept can be important for foreign policy or like policy purposes of their organizations. When we look at the left-hand side, the countries, what we have are constitutionally neutral countries, countries that are neutral through their foreign policy that they're using, neutralist strategies that some countries might use, which is again different because some countries, they say that they are neutral. Other countries in certain conflicts, they just behave neutrally. And that's also something we can study. And we have neutrality discourse when countries talk about, or people talk about, neutrality as a foreign policy that can or could be used in order to bring a resolution to a certain conflict. And then on the institutional side, you can think about humanitarian actors who actually quite often use the word or some connected phrases, like, for example, the Red Cross. The Red Cross constantly has that problem that it somehow needs to be accepted as a neutral or at least impartial player in order to have access to people whom it wants to help in dire situations. But then we also have financial institutions who continuously, even during war times, try to still fulfill their purposes. In Switzerland, we have a very important one of those, the Bank for International Settlement, which even during the height of the Second World War was still operational and still did clearings among a great number of nations. And then we have trade institutions, and actually neutrality has a lot to do with international trade and the need of countries and actors and organizations to maintain trade relationship to a certain extent, even during war. And all of these things can be studied. So it's really not just the Switzerlands and the Austrias of the world. It can be much more. I compiled a little map of countries that in one way or another are currently using some form of neutrality policy, the dark blue ones being the constitutionally neutral countries, which include some of the lesser known ones like Moldova and very, very importantly Turkmenistan, which is very staunchly neutral. The lighter blue ones are countries that use neutrality in their foreign policy. And okay, we all know that Sweden and Finland are on their way out, but as long as they're not members of NATO, I'll not delete them yet. But we also have Ireland, we have Mongolia, we have the entirety of Southeast Asia, which uses a foreign policy concept called a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality as a bloc. And the word neutrality for them plays a certain role. And then we have other countries like, for example, Afghanistan, Georgia, or Ukraine, for whom neutrality as a solution to an ongoing conflict is being hotly debated. And we are probably all aware of the discourse about a neutral Ukraine, right? That's not to say it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just to say that this is being actively discussed. And also for Afghanistan, there have been at least there's a 120-year-old history of people discussing and talking about neutrality. And Afghanistan was neutral, for example, in the Second World War and away until into the 70s, until it got invaded by the Soviet Union. But these ideas keep creeping up again and again, and that can be studied. So when we go to the question, so what is neutrality actually in IR? It's much easier to define what it is not. Let me clean up a few of the stereotypes. It is certainly not the same as isolationism. Most countries are highly involved that are neutral. Only a few of them are kind of withdrawn and hermit kingdoms. But the biggest part of the neutral actors, actually by virtue of being neutral, have to interact. Think of the Red Cross. They cannot withdraw, right? They need to be active in order to fulfill their purpose. It is not pacifism. there's only a few countries that are neutral and pacifist in the sense that they don't have militaries. The Vatican would be one, maybe Liechtenstein and Costa Rica. But apart from that, the majority of countries in the world and in history that used neutrality politics were armed or highly armed and used their militaries quite a lot. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. And neutrality is definitely not peace. Neutrality is importantly the flip side of war, not the flip side of peace. It is being at peace with those that are at war, but the neutrality itself is very much predicated on the concept of conflict and war. And that's also something I will show you in more detail in a second. And one more thing, I urge you not to think of neutrality as the middle position, but as the third position. This is beautifully encapsulated in the word itself, at least in the Greek, in the Latin version. Neutral is a compound word of ne, uter, neither of the two. So being outside of two. I'll show you a graph about this. Although I do want to emphasize something, which is that in Asian languages, this doesn't hold true anymore. You know, as soon as you use Chinese or Japanese, the word for neutrality is literally to stand in the middle. So it just shows how how problematic it can be when we want to use like a certain roots of words to explain something. But my claim is, in this instance, for the concept of neutrality, it makes more sense to think of it in the way it is conceptualized in the Latin root, being none of two. Neutrality in this sense has something to do definitely with abstaining from military alliances, at least when we talk about the country side of the concept. Alliances at least with mutual defense clauses. So a membership in NATO is by most neutrality researchers I know regarded as absolutely incompatible with neutrality, although we don't have clear definitions. Even that could be up for a dispute. But it definitely has something to do with impartiality. This word keeps coming up again and again, especially in international law. The idea of treating two or several other actors equally is quite important. And there's something, you need something like a will to be neutral. Otherwise, we know from like historical experience that countries or actors who don't want to remain neutral, they will definitely join one of two sides. So there needs to be some sort of appreciation for the concept to actually work. And I think the person who put it best is probably Thucydides around 2,500 years ago, who in his Melian dialogue actually has this beautiful passage where he defines it as, and neutrals are those who want to be friends to all and foe to neither. Friends to all and foe to neither. Because if we put that into Twitter terms, I would call it #NotMyWar. That's the neutral position. The neutral position is not one between, it's one outside of a conflict constellation. What do I mean with that? The logic of what it means to be a neutral actor is quite important here. And we can distinguish on the one hand between occasional neutrality, those actors who choose when they want to be neutral and when not. And on the other hand, we have another concept which became very important around 200 years ago, permanent neutrality. And when we think of neutral states today, we mainly think about permanent neutrals like Switzerland or Austria, but historically we've had by far more occasional neutrals. And what does occasional neutrality, or like neutrality in its basic position, look like in general? I made a little schematic. B1 and B2, belligerent 1 and belligerent 2, are both independent countries, just like A. A is the neutral in this case. And the one thing we need to remember is that in international relations, we always have bilateral relations, right? So every country has relations with every other, and that creates a huge network of bilateral relations. And that's quite key to understand the neutral position. So it happens time and again that partners of a third state end up at war with each other, right? That's unfortunately just a fact of international life. Wars happen, and they happen between at least two actors, right? Two states. But while that happens, the neutral state itself remains at peace with belligerent 1 and belligerent 2. This is no rocket science, right? This makes quite a lot of sense. But then the question is the following: where's the neutrality? in this picture. And this is quite key. The neutrality is directed towards the conflict here. The position of the neutral itself is one of peace with both belligerents, while the belligerents are at war with each other. And the neutrality itself is not directed, you're not neutral towards any of the belligerent, you're neutral towards the conflict, which then has implications for the way in which you conduct your peaceful relations with the belligerents, right? So from a neutral perspective, this is quite important. And the difference with permanent neutrality then is that while occasional neutrality is the promise of an actor to remain neutral towards this specific conflicts, permanent neutrals like Switzerland or Austria, they promise to remain neutral in all potential future conflicts of all actors around on the international scene, right? Even though at the moment, the relationship between B1 and B2 might be at peace, it could become a war. And if that happens, the neutrals promise, I will remain neutral. So it's a promise about the future. And that is something that didn't exist until about 200 years ago when Switzerland got that codified in the Vienna Congress. This idea that you would always remain neutral, because what was the case before that is that countries, small and large, especially the large ones, choose on a case-by-case basis if they wanted to remain neutral toward a conflict or not, or if they wanted to promise neutrality or not. One of the most interesting and most forgotten examples, most often forgotten examples, is definitely this one. You know, the neutrality pact between Japan and the Soviet Union that was cut out in 1941, only 6 weeks before Barbarossa, before Germany attacked the Soviet Union. What you're seeing here is Foreign Minister Matsuoka signing this so-called neutrality pact, not a non-aggression pact, a neutrality pact. That was the title of the document, and behind him standing, of course, Mr. Stalin. And this neutrality pact was surprisingly long-lasting. It lasted until the 9th of August 1945. That's actually the day the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. But until the 9th of August 1945, the Soviet Union and Japan remained at peace with each other while they were fighting each other's allies on the other end of the of the war theater, right? So the situation we had here was that Japan, which was in an alliance with Germany and Italy, was fighting a war with the United States, Great Britain, and France in the Pacific, and the Soviet Union was fighting a war with Germany and Italy in Europe. But among each other, they remained neutral, and they remained at peace, and they remained neutral towards the war at the other end of the theater, right? And this is one of the weirdest circumstances, right? But because it shows how neutrality and warfare coexist sometimes even at the same time in the same country. And you might think that this is an exception, but this was really just the last time this happened on a large scale. But in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, this happened time and again, that countries chose specifically which wars they would engage in and which ones not, and at times promise neutrality and remain at peace while fighting somebody else in another place. So in this sense, neutrality is really just one part of a conflict dynamic. And just to end this talk, I want to quickly give you an overview how this then translates into assessments about neutrality. You have basically two kinds of conflict theories that help us to think about whether this, to assess this situation. One is just war theory, which is, well, the famous George W. Bush kind of, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. That's the core of just war theory. It's like the aggressor in a war is always at fault, and the one defending is always justified in its war attempts, and not supporting the just side of a war is equal to supporting the bad side. Therefore, neutrality is immoral. That leaves very little conceptual space for neutral actors to be in. With us or against us is definitely something that doesn't help neutral actors to to be there. The other paradigm is classic realism, as expressed by Karl von Clausewitz, the idea that war is the continuation of politics by other means. If that's the way that you conceptualize and think about war, then what you get to is that neutrality is the continuation of politics by the same means. And that's okay. You don't change the way you interact with the belligerents just because they fight with each other. That's the way that classic realism would look at the situation, which is apart again from the question whether or not it is smart for tactical reasons to be neutral or not. But the decision to be neutral is under classic realism usually something that's just in the interest of states, and no judgment passed there. And with that short overview, I want to give the word back to János. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you a lot. I'm not János, but I'm Sandro, and welcome you as well from my side. So yeah, thank you very much, Pascal, for this really interesting talk, which illuminated this concept of neutrality from systematical and specifically historical point of view. We have seen thereby that apparently it is no easy task to grasp this idea of neutrality, or shall I better say ideas of neutrality, and that it meant different things in different situations among modern history, so that the thought arises, maybe we have to change the question from what is reality, neutrality, and which data do we have to collect to find out what it really means, to the rather normative question, what do we want it to mean in light of our maybe specific circumstances and purposes as actors or states. Luckily, we have an expert here with us tonight, which is very familiar to this rather normative area of research, namely philosophy, and who is who reflects nearly the whole day long about such normative questions like how should we think and maybe as well act in this or that particular area. I have the pleasure to welcome Inga, who has done her master studies in philosophy and linguistics at the Stuttgart University, and who wrote her dissertation project about the Sorites paradox and lectured already at different universities in Germany since 2018 as a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, KIT. Areas in which he mainly contributed since are philosophy of language, namely vagueness and context sensitivity, and metaphilosophy, namely conceptual analysis, and especially relevant for us tonight, conceptual engineering. Currently, she's working on issues at the intersection between the metaphilosophical debate around this method of conceptual engineering and the descriptive and normative debates around harmful speech, especially hate speech and slurs. There we see already this overlap between descriptive and normative questions, and I'm looking forward to your insights and maybe the parallels which we will find to the concept of neutrality, and maybe to a lot of other interesting and important concepts which we may have to rethink or maybe even re-engineer. So with these thoughts, I hand over to you, Inga, to present your talk, which as well will be supported by some slides, I guess. Oh, and yes. Just as a quick reminder, sorry, for you who listen to these talks, maybe there are some question marks which popping out in your heads. Already that is good, and you can write them or the reason for them down just for you, or even better directly, as János already said, on Slido, so that others can see them as well and also vote for the questions, which we will discuss afterwards. So now the stage is definitely yours, Inga.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Sandro, for the introduction. I'm very happy to talk about my research interests today and also a little bit about philosophy more generally. As you already said, I work as a postdoc in philosophy, and I did not only study philosophy, but also linguistics. So maybe it doesn't come as much of a surprise that my main research focus is on the philosophy of language. However, I'm also interested in so-called metaphilosophical questions, which are philosophical questions concerning the discipline of philosophy itself. Questions such as, what is a philosophical question? What is it that turns a question into a question of philosophy rather than, for example, physics or sociology? What is philosophy? How does it differ from the sciences? Does philosophy have a particular method? What is the goal of philosophy, or is there such a thing as philosophical progress? And as a first step to answer these questions about philosophy itself, it might be worthwhile to consider the history of Western philosophy. How did its founding fathers conceive of it? Unfortunately, there are not many founding mothers we know about. So maybe this face strikes you as familiar. This is a bust of Socrates, an ancient Greek philosopher who greatly inspired Plato. And Plato, on the other hand, or in turn, is widely held to be the founder of the Western philosophical tradition. Plato wrote about 35 dialogues, most of which feature Socrates as the main character. And what Socrates does in these dialogues is that he converses with a number of other characters, and he questions them about topics which are quite central to human life and human self-understanding. Topics such as knowledge, virtue, justice, piety, or love. So here are some examples from Plato's dialogues. For example, in the Theaetetus, Socrates asks, well, it is just this that I'm in doubt about and cannot fully grasp by my own efforts what knowledge really is. Can we tell that? What do you say? Or concerning virtue, the very question, what on earth virtue is one regarding which I don't in fact have any knowledge at all. But as for you, by the gods, Meno, what do you say virtue is? So let us focus just for a moment on the question, what is knowledge? Socrates, it seems, is not asking us to scientifically investigate knowledge. Knowledge does not allow of chemical analysis, such as water does. So we cannot observe knowledge under a microscope or conduct experiments with knowledge in a particle accelerator. Rather, Socrates' question is best understood as a conceptual question. He is interested in the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to fall under the concept of knowledge. So Socrates wants to know what exactly we mean when we ascribe knowledge to someone, or under which conditions a knowledge ascription, such as Kim knows that tomorrow is a holiday, is true. In other words, Socrates is searching for an analytic definition of the term knowledge. So, just for the sake of completeness, here is an example of a very famous attempt to give an analytic definition of knowledge. This is the so-called JTB analysis. JTB is short for justified true belief. And the idea is that some person X knows some proposition P just in case X believes that P, so that's the first condition, X is justified in believing that P, the second condition, and P is true, the third condition. Like so many attempts at analytic definitions in philosophy, the JTB analysis has been very much contested. However, many philosophers still believe that the concept of knowledge admits of analysis. So many philosophers still think that there is a correct analysis, a correct analytic definition of the concept of knowledge. Just the JTB analysis doesn't happen to be the right one, but there is a right one. Now, the previous talk by Pascal dealt with the concept of neutrality. And apparently it's not very easy to isolate a single, precise, and shared concept from the various ways in which the term politically neutral is and has been used by different parties, by different countries, for example, by different people, different researchers. Still, one might think that there must be something like a shared core concept, and that it is the or one task of neutrality studies, for example, to analyze this concept. In other words, one might think that one of the main tasks regarding the concept of neutrality is that of describing the necessary and sufficient conditions for example, a state to count as politically neutral. On the other hand, one's goal might not so much be descriptive, but rather normative. For those parties involved in debates about political neutrality, the important question might not be what neutrality actually means, or which concept or concepts the word actually expresses, but what we want the word to mean, or which concept the word should express. And much along these same lines, we have two ways of interpreting a given dispute. Say a dispute about neutrality on the face of it. So suppose Hannah claims that the United States were politically neutral during the first years of World War II. And then Raj responds, no, they weren't. Their foreign politics was isolationist. Now it seems as if Hannah and Raj disagree about a factual question, the question whether the United States were or were not politically neutral during the first years of World War II. But if that's the case, if it's really a factual question they disagree about, then they cannot both be right. Then either Hannah is correct or Raj is, but not both of them. But maybe this is not a factual disagreement at all. Maybe the real bone of contention between Hannah and Raj is not factual. Maybe they agree about all the facts. Maybe they agree about how exactly the United States acted during those first years of the Second World War. Maybe they agree about who said what and why, etc. It might be the case that Hannah and Raj's disagreement is normative and not factual. So they disagree about what the term political neutrality should mean, how it should be used. They don't say so explicitly, not here, of course. So on the surface, the dispute looks like a factual one, but we might think that underneath, this dispute might be what philosophers have called a metalinguistic negotiation, which is an implicit negotiation concerning the meaning of a given term. So Hannah and Raj maybe disagree about how the term or the concept of political neutrality should be used. And so this example brings me to finally to the main topic, or to the topic to which my talk owes its title, at least, to conceptual engineering. What is this? Well, it can mean two things. So first of all, conceptual engineering, or CE in short, is a method, a philosophical method, first and foremost, which aims at the introduction, the elimination, or the improvement of a concept, and the respective concept word, I should add, not at conceptual analysis. So the goal is not analysis, but rather the goal is introduction, elimination, or improvement. But the term CE, or conceptual engineering, is also an umbrella term for debate in metaphilosophy. In metaphilosophy, which is also a branch of philosophy, people discuss whether this elimination, introduction, or improvement of concepts is feasible at all, if it's possible, if it works, and how it works. So I'll say a bit more about these two things. So about the method and about the metaphilosophical debate now. So first, let me give you a couple of examples for concept elimination, concept introduction, and concept improvement. Maybe you agree that there are certain concepts which we, meaning which society or maybe science, are better off without, which we don't really need or which we shouldn't use any longer. As examples of such concepts we should probably get rid of, there are the concepts death drive, which is a concept of Freudian psychoanalysis, but there is no such thing as a death drive, as I think modern psychologists or current psychologists would agree. So maybe we should get rid of that concept of death drive. Another concept is the concept of race, which has also been very hotly debated in the public. There are no biological human races, but the term race still is very fraught with this biological meaning. If we think of race, we think of maybe races of animals or something like that. And there is no similar thing with humans. There are no biological races. So maybe we should get rid of this term as well. On the other hand, there are concepts which it would be worth having, good to have. For example, there is a concept in philosophy which is called supervenience. Philosophers know this concept. Lay people usually don't, but what does it mean? Well, the supervenience is a special kind of asymmetrical dependence relation between different things or different phenomena. And it's a very useful concept to have in philosophy. Many philosophical claims, many philosophical theses or theories cannot be articulated, couldn't have been developed without this concept of supervenience. To take an example which is maybe a bit more close to our everyday life, there's the concept of cisgender, which is relatively new and which is meant to express a congruence between gender identity and biological sex. And this concept might also be worth having. So we might feel the responsibility to promote the adoption of this concept by a larger community through some form of linguistic activism, for example. Still, other concepts might call for some improvement, and improvement can mean different things here. It might mean precisification, disambiguation, or expansion, so making the concept wider so that many more cases are included. And well, what are good examples for the improvement of concepts? Well, think of the concepts expressed by probability. In the sciences, we now usually distinguish between subjective and objective probability. And that's progress. We don't just talk about probability in whatever vague or ambiguous sense, but in the sciences, we distinguish between different kinds of probability, and we give or try to give them a precise mathematical formulation. That's an improvement. Another example, again, a bit more close, I think, to our everyday experience is the concept of marriage, which nowadays, and at least in some countries, includes same-sex couples. But marriage for a long time has been a concept where same-sex couples have been excluded. Yeah, and maybe neutrality is a concept to be improved as well. I'm not sure about that because it's not a concept I have thought much about until now. But maybe it is such a concept which calls for improvement and not just for analysis. So now let me just mention some of the metaphilosophical questions which are related to conceptual engineering. Well, one question that philosophers ask themselves is whether it's even possible to engineer concepts at will. There might be different obstacles to doing so. And what these obstacles are depends a lot on what our picture of language is. Maybe language just isn't the right kind of thing to be engineered at will. Maybe it's beyond our control or beyond our reach to do so. So that's one question. Is it even possible to engineer concepts? Then there's a question which is related to the notion of improvement, not so much to introduction or elimination of concepts. And that's the question of whether it's logically possible to improve an existing concept. Take the concept of neutrality and suppose that there exists one core concept of neutrality. How can we improve upon that? Well, maybe we can't. Maybe every improvement is just the introduction of a new concept. So the question basically is, how can we make sure that the concept really stays the same, even though we alter it in some way? Don't we just change or exchange a given concept for a newer one? So what allows us to speak of the improvement of one and the same concept? That's another logical question, maybe. And then there's the question of whether there are any unforeseeable or potentially harmful consequences of conceptual engineering or of linguistic activism more generally. So maybe we want to improve upon our given conceptual apparatus, but we end up doing more harm than good. This could also be a possibility, and that's also a question which is discussed in philosophy mainly. So just to wrap up, a very short summary. I told you a little bit, or mainly I think, I told you about two different approaches, two different methods in philosophy, which both have been very important in the history, throughout the history of philosophy. On the one hand, there's the Socratic method, a form of conceptual analysis with the aim of better understanding how we actually use existing concepts, what we actually mean by them, and the goal to give a definition in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. And on the other hand, there are more normative approaches, which are variously called conceptual engineering or explication or amelioration. So there are very different terms for what's essentially the same thing or the same method, and where the goal is to, basically to improve upon our given conceptual apparatus, our given way to conceptualize the world. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Inga, as well, a lot for this as well very interesting talk and this introduction in this really interesting philosophical method, which seems to be relevant as well in the political area, which we discuss here. Luckily, you two will stay a bit longer with us so that we can dig a little bit deeper in at least 2 or 3 areas. We already have some questions on Slido. If you need to think and write your questions down, so you can do that right now. While you're doing that, I will throw the first question in, maybe for you too, to maybe build as well a little bit some kind of a bridge between these talks right now. So this conceptual work, these intended changes in different concepts, in as you discussed it or presented it, Inga, my question would be: are they some kind of arbitrary? And to maybe contextualize and sharpen the point a bit, is there some kind of a tension between holding the meaning of concepts like neutrality, as we discussed it, fixed, so that by saying that one is neutral, one commits him or herself to these fixed norms that come along with this concept, like, as we heard, not participating in certain military collaboration projects, for example, on the one hand, and by interpreting the meaning as something flexible, so that it is possible to engineer the concepts as one wants it in an opportunistic way, so that if it presents interesting for one country to define the concept under certain circumstances in a way that such collaborations are not forbidden, maybe, but that as a consequence, the concept loses its original associated meaning and maybe as well its power. So is there something like a middle way between interpreting concepts as fixed and interpreting them as flexible, or does it depend on the context, or how would you tackle this challenge? I'll let you to choose who wants to answer the question first.
Maybe I will start, if that's okay. So your first question was whether this change or so-called improvement is arbitrary, and I don't think so. So I think that these proposed changes or improvements have to be argued for, usually, or should be argued for, ideally. And in order to do so, we should become clear about what the purpose of, first of all, of the given concept is, and then what we think serves this purpose better, maybe. And your second question you also asked the question whether some conceptual changes might result in a loss of power, in a sense. And yes, I think so. So there has been this debate about the concept of racism, for example. And there is this structural or systemic sense of racism, according to which where there are just racist structures in societies which discriminate against certain groups of people. And then there's a problem if you try to take this structural concept of racism and try to say then who is a racist. And there have been certain accounts according to which everyone who participates in these structures or somehow benefits from these structures, even unknowingly, is racist. And that's maybe problematic because then all of us, or the largest part of German citizens, say, would be racist, or a very large part would be racist. And that's maybe problematic because then the term racism or racist, the accusation of being a racist, loses maybe some of its power. If we're all racists, well, then should I be worried now? Or so that's maybe problematic. So this might be a case where conceptual engineering might might go too far, because although the structural concept of racism does make sense and it's important to have it, it's maybe not as easy to translate it or to also speak about individual people in this way. So that's just an example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there seem to be some kind of boundaries to this method of conceptual engineering. Okay. Yes, maybe Pascal, you want to add something?
Yeah, I find this discussion quite interesting, because especially for the example you gave in the presentation, the difference between neutrality and isolationism when it comes to the United States back in or shortly before the Second World War, a conceptual shift did take place in our common understanding of what US policy was. And this is a very interesting thing to observe, because if you go back and you read the records of the 1930s, the people who ardently supported not going to war in Europe or the United States or Asia were called themselves neutralists. We are neutralists. We want the United States to be neutral. This neutrality idea was like very important in the political discourse of the days. And then came the war, and then something happened. And suddenly the what happened back then was not described anymore as neutralism or neutralist sentiments. It was described as isolationism. And this idea stuck. It sticks so hard that there's a beautiful paper in 2014 written by a very good historian who tried to explain why it might make a little bit more sense to understand that period as a period of neutralist sentiments and not isolationism. But she had to use a lot of arguments to say, like, why does it make more sense to use the historical concept and not this ahistorical kind of post facto description? Which leads me to the question, how do we, or how would you, Inga, differentiate between conceptual engineering, political engineering, and what often is just called propaganda, when you try to create a certain perception among a certain group of something by using very specific words instead of others? That must be a huge debate, I suppose, in that field. And actually, neutrality is touched by it in that sense, that you can see over time this battle for like interpretation, whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, whom it helps, who it doesn't, and what it should be called, and then legitimization and delegitimization of that position. And well, so far I couldn't find a clear-cut answer, but I wonder how you would differentiate these three.
I'm not so sure whether I can provide a clear cut between those different things. But so what was the second? Sorry, remind me. The third was propaganda and
conceptual engineering, political engineering, like spin doctoring of certain terms.
Okay.
And well, then maybe propaganda is just the same. I don't know. It's like I just wonder if that's a debate or not.
Yeah, I didn't really know about the term political engineering, so I didn't really know what concepts to assign to this term. Well, I think that one difference between mere propaganda and conceptual engineering is exactly the idea that in conceptual engineering you argue for a certain use of the term. So you don't just use it in any given way you like, but you try to provide arguments for why this use is sensible or rational or better. Which important phenomenon is captured by this different use, or by this broadened concept or narrowed concept or whatever. So I'd say that's a key difference. That conceptual engineering, I think, is a rational activity which is backed up by arguments, and yeah, which shouldn't just yeah, it's nothing that should be done behind closed doors or something. And spin doctoring, well, yeah, I'm not sure what exactly spin doctor. So you twist the story, or would dog whistling or something? That's not spin doctoring, right?
Yeah, or like the
political dog whistles,
something in
or...
that way. But what you just said makes a lot of sense. If like conceptual engineering is something you do out in the open and you throw it out there to discuss actually whether it makes sense or not, then that would clearly differentiate it from, like, let's say, a decision taken behind closed doors to say, like, okay, let's notch the general public away from thinking about this as neutrality, and let's make them think, let's try to establish the idea that it was a term that is clearly negatively connotated, which is not you don't do that out in the open. And you see that sometimes in political discourse happening when certain actions are described by a certain group of actors in the same way, without ever having a public debate whether it even makes sense to call it that. So that's a good, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
Yes. So in philosophy, it seems that or in conceptual engineering, these arguments are or should be explicit and try to argue for certain purposes, goals, while maybe in propaganda it can be made implicitly. Or okay, so that could be a difference. I'd like to take one or two other questions from Slido into the room. So somebody asked, what is, on your opinion, I think that goes to you, Pascal, the greatest challenges for a country being neutral nowadays? And maybe in addition to that, how can a country, no, sorry, it was the other one, where was it in the, where, sorry, the question was as well, has it changed nowadays, the complexity in the global trading context? Like, did it become more complicated to be neutral as a state since we now live in a more globalized world?
Maybe as a quick answer, no, it has always been difficult. It's just the difficulty changes. I think the one of the Sweden's former prime ministers said it quite well. I'm just trying to remember his name. Östen Undén. He was prime minister right after the Second World War, and even before, he was like very, very important in Swedish foreign policy making. And he, right before the Second World War, put it in this way: I think it must be accepted that the apostles of neutrality will never be heralded as the saviors of mankind. The problem for the neutral position is that you're never, if you're neutral and you remain neutral, you will never be on the side that loses a war, but you will also never be on the side that wins one. So you will always be criticized for not supporting the winning side. And even though you might then escape the worst allegations of like war crimes, etc., you will always be attacked for not supporting the right side, and that never changes. So also now in the current age, you can see how countries like China or India are criticized for not joining the sanction system against Russia, and that's a very, very natural thing to happen, because by the way war psychology works, countries don't go to war just because they think maybe it's a good idea. They go to war because they believe that this is the most important thing they have to do right now in order to get what needs to be done. So naturally, they will do everything in their power to notch others and the undecided ones to their side. And that has always been around. So, and then the alliances shift, or like whether one country leans to this side or to that side, and neutrality is never purely impartial. And that changes over time, but it's always difficult.
Okay. So unfortunately, it's time is already nearly over, as I see, and yeah, as always, with interesting descriptive take-home message from your talks and the discussion maybe as well. So Pascal, of course, we hope that it will be more, but if it's just one thing that we remember from your talk, what should it be in one phrase, maybe?
Being neutral means to be in the third position, not in the middle.
Okay, thank you. And from yours, Inga?
Oh, that's hard for me to say. Well, I think maybe that's the question of, or that there are extremely interesting questions related to how we use concepts, what concepts exactly are, and yeah, how we can or should change them.
Yes, yeah, it's always difficult to pack big thoughts into one phrase, but thank you too for this short catch up. So thank you a lot, Pascal and Inga, for these last and all the other words which certainly inspired for further thinking and reconsideration of conceptualizing neutrality, as well as a lot of other concepts, as we have seen. Thanks as well to the REACH Association for giving us the opportunity to organize this May's nanoTalks, and of course the listeners for your attention and interesting questions. If you enjoyed the talks and liked the opportunity to ask questions, but you would like to discuss them even more, you should definitely check out our format PPS, where we do exactly that while eating, as Janos already said, a tasty pizza. You find further information for these and other upcoming events, like the June nanoTalks, which will be about animal experiments, on our website. All right, I guess that's it, isn't it, Janos? Or have I forgotten something or someone?
I would also like to thank you, Sandra, for hosting the Q&A, and everybody else behind the scenes for making a smooth live stream, namely Laura and Vanessa. And of course, the speakers. It was really interesting. I would have loved to listen for 1 hour more, but unfortunately, we need to finish now with Swiss punctuality.
Yes, thank you as well. Yeah, then I wish you all a good rest of the evening or the night or whatever time it is when you hear or see this. And yeah, see you next time.
Thank you too.
Thank you. Bye.